The crowd went silent for a moment, then burst into laughter as the Duke's words rang across the lawn. "Let her attempt it," he said, chuckling, waving his glass toward the young woman standing near the fountain. Eleanor Hartley did not move. She did not flinch. She stood with her chin raised, while nearly 200 guests turned to stare at her, some smiling behind gloved hands, some openly laughing along with the man who had just humiliated her in front of all of Ashcombe County. Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe was not a cruel man by nature, or so people said. But pride had a way of turning even gentle men sharp when they felt challenged. Eleanor had just declared, in front of his closest friends and half the county's landowners, that she would enter her own horse in the Ashcombe Cup, the race his family had won for 11 years running, and that she would beat his champion, Thundercrest, before the leaves fell in November. The Duke had laughed first, out of surprise, then out of amusement, and finally out of something closer to disbelief. A woman, riding her own horse, entering a race meant for the finest trainers and riders in the region, a race his own grandfather had founded. It was almost too absurd to be insulting. Almost. "You may enter if you wish," he said, still smiling, swirling the wine in his glass. "I will not stop you. In fact, I welcome it. It will be good for the crowd to see a real challenge, even if it comes to nothing." A ripple of laughter followed him as he turned back to his guests, already forgetting her, already moving on to the next conversation about hunting dogs or harvest yields. But Eleanor did not forget. She stood there a moment longer, feeling the heat rise in her chest, not from embarrassment, but from something harder and more determined. Her friend Charlotte Bell appeared at her side, touching her arm gently. "Eleanor, you don't have to prove anything to him. Let it go. He'll forget by supper." "He might forget," Eleanor said quietly, "but I won't. And by November, neither will anyone else in this county." The two women walked away from the garden party together, past rows of trimmed hedges, and the low murmur of gossip already spreading like smoke through dry grass. By the time they reached the gate, 3 different groups of guests were already repeating the story, each version growing a little more dramatic than the last. In one telling, Eleanor had shouted at the Duke. In another, she had thrown her drink at his feet. None of it was true, but truth rarely mattered once a story began to travel through a crowd hungry for entertainment. Eleanor's family was not wealthy, not anymore. Her father, once a respected horse breeder, had lost most of his fortune 2 years earlier, when a bad investment in shipping had gone wrong. Since then, the Hartley estate had shrunk from 6 stables to 1, and most of their finest horses had been sold to pay off debts. Only one horse remained that Eleanor truly trusted, a dark bay mare named Whisper, strong-legged and quick, but untested against anything like the Duke's champion. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, Eleanor walked to the stable alone. Whisper nickered softly as she approached, pressing her nose against Eleanor's shoulder. Eleanor rested her forehead against the mare's neck for a long moment, breathing in the familiar smell of hay and warm horse. "They think we can't do it," she whispered. "They think we're a joke." Whisper shifted her weight, ears flicking forward as if she understood every word. "We have until November," Eleanor said. "That's all the time we get." She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small room, replaying the Duke's chuckle over and over in her mind, hearing the laughter of the crowd echo through her thoughts, like a bell that would not stop ringing. She thought of her father, who had once been the most respected name in horse breeding for 3 counties, now reduced to quiet nods and polite refusals whenever anyone mentioned racing. She thought of her mother, who had passed 2 winters ago, and who had always told her that pride was only useful if you had the courage to back it up with action. By morning, Eleanor had made her decision. She would not simply enter the race to save face, she would win it. The following day, she visited the only person she trusted enough to help her, a retired trainer named Mr. Pruitt, who had once worked for her father before the family's fortunes collapsed. He lived on the edge of the county, in a small cottage, surrounded by fields he no longer used for training. His knees too weak now to mount a horse, though his mind remained as sharp as ever. "You want to race against Thundercrest," Mr. Pruitt said slowly, after Eleanor explained everything. He did not laugh, which surprised her more than if he had. "That horse has won every race for 6 years. He is fast, strong, and trained by the best money can buy." "I know," Eleanor said. And you want to do this with Whisper, a mare who has never raced competitively in her life. I know that too. Mr. Pruitt studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if measuring something invisible between them. Finally, he nodded. Your mother once told me something. She said the fastest horse in the county isn't always the one who wins. Sometimes, it's the one who wants it more, and the one who is trained properly for the ground they will race on. Will you help me? Eleanor asked. I am old, and my back aches every morning, Mr. Pruitt said. But yes, I will help you. Not because I think you can win easily. I think it will be one of the hardest things you ever do, but because someone should remind that man that laughter doesn't always get the last word. Word of the wager spread quickly through the county in the days that followed, and not always kindly. Some admired Eleanor's boldness, calling her brave for standing up to a man as powerful as the Duke. Others whispered that she was foolish, that she was only setting herself up for a public embarrassment far worse than the one she had already endured. A few, particularly among the Duke's circle, seemed almost pleased by the idea, eager to watch her fail so publicly that she would never dare challenge anyone of standing again. One of these was Henry Vale, a sharp-tongued man who managed much of the Duke's stable affairs, and who had never liked the Hartley family, not since Eleanor's father had once outbid him on a prized stallion many years earlier. When he heard about the wager, a slow smile spread across his face. She won't last a week of real training, he told one of the stable boys, loud enough for others to hear. And even if she does, Thundercrest has never lost, not once, not to anyone. The stable boy, a quiet young man named Daniel Foxwell, said nothing in response, though something in his expression suggested he did not entirely agree. Daniel had worked in the Duke's stables for 3 years, ever since his own family's small farm had failed, and he understood horses in a way few others did, reading their moods and needs with a patience that came from genuine care rather than mere duty. He had seen Whisper once, years earlier, when Eleanor's father still kept a full stable, and he remembered thinking even then that the mare had something special in her stride, something most people overlooked because she was smaller and quieter than the flashier horses around her. He did not say any of this out loud, not yet. He kept his thoughts to himself and returned to his work, though his mind kept wandering back to the wager and the woman who had dared to make it. Meanwhile, Eleanor began her training the very next morning. She rose before dawn, while the sky was still a deep blue-gray and the air held the cool bite of early autumn. Mr. Pruitt met her at the stable, leaning heavily on his cane, but moving with a purpose that belied his age. First, he said, we forget about Thundercrest. We forget about the Duke, the crowd, the wager, all of it. Today, we only think about Whisper, what she can do, what she needs to become stronger. For the first week, they focused on simple things, building the mare's endurance with long, steady rides across the hills surrounding the Hartley estate. Eleanor learned to read every twitch of Whisper's ears, every subtle shift in her breathing, understanding her partner in a way she had never taken the time to before. It was slow work, and some mornings felt discouraging, especially when Whisper tired faster than expected or stumbled on uneven ground. But Eleanor did not give up. Each evening, after hours of training, she would sit by the stable fire with Mr. Pruitt, listening to his stories of races long past, learning strategies that had nothing to do with raw speed and everything to do with patience, timing, and knowing exactly when to push forward and when to hold back. News of her daily training soon reached the Duke, carried to him through servants and stable hands, who found the whole situation rather entertaining. He said little about it publicly, though privately, he found himself curious, despite his best efforts to dismiss the matter entirely. He had meant his words as a joke, nothing more, a way to deflect an awkward moment at a garden party. He had not expected the woman to take it quite so seriously. One afternoon, while riding along the border between his land and the Hartley estate, the Duke caught sight of Eleanor training in a distant field, urging Whisper over a series of low hurdles Mr. Pruitt had constructed from old fence posts. He slowed his horse, watching for longer than he intended, noting the determination in the way she sat, the focus in her posture, the surprising grace of the mare beneath her. He told himself it meant nothing. He rode on before she noticed him, telling himself he had far more important matters to attend to than watching a woman train a horse that stood no real chance against his own. But that night, for reasons he could not quite explain to himself, He found himself thinking about that image more than once, the quiet determination on her face refusing to leave his thoughts as easily as he wished it would. By the end of the first week, word had spread even further, reaching neighboring counties, and drawing a curious mixture of supporters and skeptics, to watch Eleanor's progress from a respectful distance. Some mornings, small groups gathered along the fence line, bordering the Hartley property, whispering among themselves as they watched her ride. Eleanor tried her best to ignore them, focusing only on the work at hand, though she could not deny the added pressure their presence brought with it. Charlotte visited often, bringing food and encouragement, though she never stopped worrying about her friend's safety and reputation. "The whole county is watching you," she said one evening, as they sat together after a particularly grueling training session. "If this doesn't work, Eleanor, they will never let you forget it." "I know," Eleanor said simply. "But if I don't try, I'll never forgive myself either." As the days passed, the training grew harder, the stakes grew clearer, and the wager that had begun as a careless chuckle at a garden party began to take on a weight that neither Eleanor nor the Duke had fully anticipated. November was still months away, but already, the entire county seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see whether the quiet young woman with the dark bay mare could truly challenge the champion that had never known defeat. Eleanor did not know, as she rode Whisper across the fields each morning, just how much would change before the race finally arrived. She did not know about the sabotage that would test her resolve, the unexpected ally who would risk everything to help her, or the moment when the Duke himself would stop laughing entirely and start to wonder if he had made a very serious mistake. All she knew, as the sun rose over the hills and Whisper's hooves pounded steady rhythms into the soft earth, was that she would not stop. Not now. Not after everything that had already been said and done. The wager had been made in laughter, but Eleanor intended to answer it with something far more powerful than words. She intended to answer it with proof. The second week of training began with a storm that rolled in from the western hills, soaking the fields and turning the training ground into a stretch of heavy mud. Eleanor stood at the stable door at dawn, watching the rain fall in gray sheets, feeling a familiar tightness in her chest. Every day mattered now. Every hour lost to weather was an hour the Duke's champion did not lose, since his stables were larger, drier, and equipped with covered training rings that the Hartley estate could no longer afford. "We work anyway," Mr. Pruitt said, appearing beside her with a heavy coat thrown over his shoulders. "Thundercrest trains in comfort. Whisper will learn to run in conditions he has never faced. That may become useful, more useful than you think, before this is over." Eleanor nodded, pulling on her boots and leading Whisper out into the rain. The mare tossed her head at first, unused to the noise of thunder rolling across the hills. But Eleanor stayed close, speaking softly, guiding her through the wet grass, until the horse settled into a steady trot despite the storm around them. By the time the rain eased in the afternoon, both horse and rider were soaked through. But something had shifted between them, a deeper trust forged in difficult conditions neither had chosen. That evening, as Eleanor toweled down Whisper in the stable, she heard footsteps approaching from outside. She turned, expecting Charlotte or Mr. Pruitt, but instead found a young man standing near the entrance, hesitant, his cap pulled low against the last of the rain. "I did not mean to intrude," he said quickly. "My name is Daniel Foxwell. I work in the Duke's stables." Eleanor straightened, suspicion flickering through her at the mention of the Duke's household. "Did he send you to check on my progress? To report back and laugh about it later?" "No," Daniel said, shaking his head firmly. "No one sent me. I came on my own." He paused, glancing at Whisper before continuing. "I have watched this mare since she was young. I always believed she had something special in her, something the other horses in your father's old stable never quite matched. I wanted to see for myself if that was still true." Eleanor studied him carefully, unsure whether to trust a man who spent his days caring for the very horse she intended to defeat. "And what did you see?" "I saw a mare who trusts her rider completely," Daniel said. "That is worth more than most people realize. Thundercrest is fast, faster than almost any horse I have ever seen. But he does not trust easily. He responds to command, not partnership. There is a difference, and in a long race, that difference can matter." His words stayed with Eleanor long after he left that evening, though she remained cautious about his true intentions. She mentioned the visit to Mr. Pruitt the following morning, watching his reaction closely. "Daniel Foxwell," the old trainer said thoughtfully, stroking his chin. I remember his father. Good, honest people, until hard times took their farm. The boy has always had a gift with horses, even as a child. If he offers to help, I would not refuse it outright. But watch him carefully. Trust is earned slowly, especially now. Over the following days, Daniel returned several more times, always in the evenings after his duties at the Duke's stables were finished, always careful not to be seen leaving his usual paths. He offered small pieces of advice at first, suggestions about pacing and breathing techniques that seemed to make an immediate difference in Whisper's endurance. Eleanor remained guarded, though she found herself listening more closely each time he spoke, recognizing genuine knowledge behind his quiet words. Meanwhile, at the Ashcombe estate, tension of a different kind was building. Henry Vale had grown increasingly irritated by the persistent rumors of Eleanor's progress, rumors that seemed to grow bolder and more detailed with each passing week. He worried, though he would never have admitted it aloud, that the wager the Duke had made so carelessly might actually become a genuine threat to Thundercrest's unbroken record, a record Henry had built much of his own reputation around maintaining. She trains in the mud like a common farmhand, he scoffed one evening, speaking to a group of stable workers gathered near the tack room. Let her ruin herself, and that poor animal. It changes nothing. Thundercrest will run the cup as he always has, and this entire foolish wager will be forgotten by December. But not everyone shared his confidence. Some of the older stable hands, men who had worked with horses long enough to recognize genuine talent when they saw it, had begun to quietly admire the stories filtering in about Eleanor's determination. A few even wondered, in private conversations far from Henry's hearing, whether the Duke had made a mistake in dismissing her so quickly. The Duke himself remained outwardly unconcerned, attending to his usual business of managing the estate, meeting with tenants, and preparing for the autumn harvest that occupied much of his attention during these weeks. Yet more than once, he found his thoughts drifting back to the image of Eleanor training in that distant field, and more than once, he caught himself asking servants for updates on her progress, always framing the questions as idle curiosity rather than genuine interest. One afternoon, while inspecting the eastern fields with his estate manager, the Duke passed close enough to the Hartley property to hear the distant sound of hoofbeats and encouraging shouts carried on the wind. He paused his horse, listening for a long moment, before continuing on his way, saying nothing to his companion about the strange unease settling in his chest. Back at the Hartley stable, Eleanor's training continued to intensify. Mr. Pruitt introduced longer distances, mimicking the actual length of the Ashcombe Cup course, a grueling stretch of nearly 4 miles that wound through hills, forests, and open meadows before finishing on the wide green stretch in front of Ashcombe Hall itself. Whisper struggled at first with the increased distance, her stamina tested in ways it had never been before. But with each passing day, she grew stronger, her breathing steadier, her stride more confident across varied terrain. Daniel continued his quiet visits, offering guidance on managing the mare's energy across such a long course, teaching Eleanor techniques for conserving strength during the early miles, while saving enough for a powerful finish. His knowledge proved invaluable, though Eleanor still wondered privately what truly motivated him to risk so much by helping a rival stable behind his employer's back. "Why are you really doing this?" she finally asked him one evening, as they walked together along the fence line, separating the training field from the surrounding woods. Daniel was quiet for a long moment before answering. "My family lost everything years ago, much like yours did. No one gave us a chance to prove ourselves again. I suppose I want to see someone succeed against odds that seem impossible. It reminds me that things can still turn out differently than they appear at first." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding settling over her like a warm blanket against the evening chill. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing this is possible." "I do not know if it is possible," Daniel admitted honestly, "but I believe it is worth trying, and that matters just as much." As October approached, bringing cooler mornings and shorter days, Eleanor's training reached a new intensity. She and Whisper now covered the full distance of the racecourse regularly, their times improving steadily under Mr. Pruitt's careful guidance and Daniel's quiet contributions. Word continued to spread throughout the county, and the crowds gathering to watch her training sessions grew larger with each passing week, no longer merely curious onlookers, but genuine supporters, drawn by the story of a young woman refusing to accept defeat before she had even begun. Yet beneath this growing momentum, A quiet unease continued to build as well. Henry Vale, increasingly desperate to protect Thundercrest's reputation and his own standing within the Duke's household, began contemplating measures far beyond simple dismissive comments. He started paying closer attention to Eleanor's training schedule, noting the times she rode, the paths she favored, and the growing crowd of supporters who gathered to watch her progress. Eleanor remained unaware of the darker currents building against her, focused entirely on the growing bond between herself and Whisper, and on the steady improvement in their training results. She could not yet know that the greatest challenge of her preparation would not come from the physical demands of distance and terrain, but from a threat far more calculated, one designed specifically to ensure she never reached the starting line at all. A cartwheel snapped clean in half on the narrow bridge path, sending Eleanor's supply cart tipping sideways into the ditch, feed sacks bursting open across the wet grass. She jumped clear just in time, her heart pounding, staring at the broken axle with a growing sense that something was very wrong. This was the third accident in 2 weeks. First a torn saddle strap that nearly threw her during a morning ride. Then a gate left open overnight that let Whisper wander dangerously close to the main road. Now this. Wheels do not simply break on their own, Mr. Pruitt said grimly, kneeling beside the wreckage and running his fingers along the splintered wood. Look here. This was cut, not worn through. Someone wanted this cart to fail exactly where it did, on the narrow bridge, where a fall could have seriously hurt you, or the horse pulling it. Eleanor felt a cold chill move through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Who would do this? Someone who does not want you to reach November, Mr. Pruitt said simply. They said nothing more about it that day, but Eleanor began watching her surroundings more carefully, noticing details she had previously overlooked. Strange footprints near the stable at odd hours, a missing latch on the feed room door, a stranger's horse tied near the property line one morning, gone by the time she went to investigate. Someone was testing her, probing for weaknesses, and growing bolder with each passing week. Charlotte grew increasingly worried during this time, visiting more frequently and urging Eleanor to consider withdrawing from the wager altogether. This has gone too far, she said one evening, watching Eleanor clean a fresh scrape along her forearm from the cart accident. It was one thing when people were only laughing at you. Now someone is actually trying to hurt you. If I withdraw now, everything they have done will have worked, Eleanor replied firmly. I refuse to let fear decide this for me. Daniel arrived later that same evening, his expression tense as he approached the stable. I overheard something today, he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder, despite being far from the Duke's property. Henry Vale was speaking with a man I did not recognize, someone who does not work in the stables. They stopped talking the moment I came near, but I heard enough to know they were discussing you, and discussing ways to slow your progress before the race. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Henry Vale, the Duke's stable manager. He has never liked your family, Daniel confirmed. There was some dispute years ago, before I started working there. Something about a horse your father purchased that Henry wanted for himself. I do not know all the details, but the resentment runs deep, deeper than simple professional rivalry. Does the Duke know what Henry is doing? Eleanor asked. Daniel hesitated before answering. I do not believe so. The Duke pays little attention to the daily operations of the stables these days. He trusts Henry completely, perhaps too completely. This revelation troubled Eleanor more than she expected. She had assumed, without fully realizing it, that any sabotage against her would come with at least the Duke's tacit approval, some quiet nod from the man who had mocked her so publicly. Learning that Henry acted independently, driven by his own private grudge, made the danger feel less predictable, and somehow more unsettling. The following week brought the most serious incident yet. Eleanor arrived at the stable one morning to find Whisper standing unusually still, her breathing shallow, sweat darkening her coat despite the cool morning air. Mr. Pruitt examined the mare quickly, his weathered face growing pale as he checked her eyes, her gums, the rapid flutter of her pulse beneath his fingers. Someone has given her something, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Not enough to kill her, but enough to weaken her badly for days. This was no accident, Eleanor. This was deliberate. Eleanor knelt beside Whisper, pressing her palm against the mare's trembling neck, fighting back tears of fury and fear in equal measure. Will she recover? With rest and care, yes, Mr. Pruitt said. But she cannot train for at least a week, perhaps longer. Whoever did this understood exactly how much time we could afford to lose, and took it from us anyway. Word of the poisoning spread through the county faster than any previous rumor, and this time, the reaction shifted noticeably. Many who had previously found the entire wager amusing now expressed genuine outrage that someone would target an innocent animal simply to prevent a fair competition. Support for Eleanor grew stronger in the wake of the incident, though it did little to ease her private fear that worse might still be coming. News eventually reached the Duke himself, delivered by a servant who described the situation with careful neutrality, unsure how his employer would react. The Duke listened in silence, his expression unreadable, before dismissing the servant and sitting alone in his study for a long while afterward. He had meant his words at the garden party as nothing more than a careless joke, a way to deflect attention from an awkward social moment. He had never intended for anyone to be genuinely harmed as a result. The thought that his own household might be responsible for such actions, taken without his knowledge or consent, left him deeply unsettled. That evening, he summoned Henry Vale to his study, studying the man carefully as he entered. "Rumors are spreading that Miss Hartley's horse has been poisoned," the Duke said directly, watching Henry's reaction closely. "A terrible business," Henry replied smoothly, his expression carefully neutral. "Though I confess, I am not entirely surprised. Amateur trainers often make careless mistakes with feed and medicine. It happens more often than people realize." The Duke studied him a moment longer, something in Henry's tone striking him as slightly too rehearsed, too quick to dismiss the possibility of foul play. He said nothing further on the matter that evening, but a seed of suspicion had been planted, one that would grow steadily in the weeks that followed. Meanwhile, at the Hartley stable, Eleanor refused to let the setback break her resolve. While Whisper recovered under careful supervision, Eleanor spent her days studying the racecourse itself, walking every mile on foot alongside Mr. Pruitt, memorizing every rise and fall of the terrain, every turn where a horse might stumble or lose precious time. Daniel joined them when he could slip away from his duties, offering insights from years spent studying Thundercrest's racing patterns. "He is strongest in the middle miles," Daniel explained one afternoon, as they stood atop a low hill overlooking a long stretch of open meadow that formed part of the course. "His trainers push him hard early, then let him settle into a comfortable rhythm through here, before demanding one final burst of speed in the last half mile toward the finish. Then that is where we must be strongest too," Eleanor said, studying the terrain with newfound determination. "Not in matching his speed exactly, but in knowing precisely when to make our own move." By the time Whisper had fully recovered, nearly 10 days later, Eleanor had developed a clearer strategy than ever before. One built not merely on raw physical training, but on genuine understanding of the course and her opponent's tendencies. The sabotage, rather than breaking her spirit, had somehow sharpened her focus, reminding her exactly how much was at stake and how determined her opponents truly were to see her fail. Yet even as her resolve strengthened, the danger surrounding her had not disappeared. Henry Vale, having failed to permanently derail her progress, began considering measures far more drastic than a poisoned feed or a damaged cartwheel. Measures that would put not only Eleanor's chances at the Ashcombe Cup at risk, but potentially her safety as well. A hooded figure moved through the darkness near the Hartley stable just after midnight, testing the latch on the feed room door with slow, careful hands. Daniel Foxwell, hidden behind a stack of hay bales where he had been keeping watch for the past 3 nights, held perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs as he studied the intruder's movements. He recognized the build immediately, the particular way the man favored his left shoulder, an old injury Henry Vale had carried for years. Daniel waited until Henry had fully entered the feed room before stepping out from his hiding place, deliberately letting his boot scrape against the gravel path. Henry spun around, his lantern nearly slipping from his grip. "Foxwell," Henry said, recovering quickly, forcing a casual tone into his voice. "I did not expect to find you here at this hour." "I could say the same of you," Daniel replied evenly. "This is not your stable, and this is not your feed room." "I was merely checking on a rumor," Henry said, his eyes darting toward the exit. "Nothing more." "You were checking on a rumor, with a bottle of something hidden in your coat pocket," Daniel said, nodding toward the small glass container Henry had not fully concealed. "The same kind of bottle, I would guess, that made Whisper so ill 2 weeks ago." Henry's expression hardened, the pretense of innocence dropping away entirely. "You would risk your position, your entire future, To protect a stable that will never be able to pay you what the Duke's household offers? I would risk it to stop something wrong from happening, Daniel said firmly. Leave now, Henry, and I will say nothing of this to anyone tonight. But if you return, I will bring this directly to the Duke himself, and let him decide what to make of his stable manager's private activities. Henry hesitated for a long moment, clearly weighing his options, before finally turning and disappearing into the darkness without another word. Daniel remained standing there for several minutes afterward, his hands trembling slightly from the confrontation, before finally making his way to Eleanor's door to tell her everything that had happened. Eleanor listened in stunned silence as Daniel recounted the encounter, her mind racing through the implications. You confronted him alone? He could have hurt you. I considered that risk worth taking, Daniel said simply. Someone needed to stop him before he did something even worse than what he has already attempted. Why didn't you bring this to me sooner? The watching, the suspicion, all of it? I did not want to worry you further until I had proof, Daniel admitted. I am sorry for that. It was perhaps a mistake. Eleanor considered this for a long moment, gratitude and lingering unease mixing together in her chest. Thank you, Daniel. Truly. But we cannot let this rest here. He may try again, in a different way, when he thinks we are no longer watching. The following morning, Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. Rather than continuing to endure Henry's sabotage in silence, she decided to bring the matter directly to the one person with the authority to stop it, regardless of how uncomfortable the conversation might prove to be. She rode to Ashcombe Hall alone, refusing Charlotte's offer to accompany her, and requested an audience with the Duke himself. The household staff seemed surprised by her arrival, whispering among themselves as they led her through the grand entrance hall toward the Duke's private study. Nathaniel Ashcombe looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression shifting from mild surprise to careful attention as he took in her serious demeanor. Miss Hartley, this is unexpected. I would not have come if the matter were not serious, Eleanor said, standing straight despite the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. Your stable manager, Henry Vale, has been sabotaging my training for weeks. A cut wheel axle. A poisoned feed that nearly killed my horse. Last night, my own witness caught him attempting to return for a second attempt. The Duke's expression darkened noticeably as she spoke, any trace of his usual amused detachment disappearing entirely. These are serious accusations, Miss Hartley. Do you have proof? Daniel Foxwell, one of your own stable hands, confronted him directly last night and can confirm everything I have told you, Eleanor said. I understand you may be reluctant to believe such claims about a trusted employee, but I did not come here today to seek your sympathy. I came because I believe you are a man who values fair competition, regardless of your earlier comments at the garden party. If Henry Vale continues his actions unchecked, whatever result comes from the Ashcombe Cup will mean nothing to either of us. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that Eleanor could not quite name. He had already harbored private suspicions about Henry, following their earlier conversation, and Eleanor's account, delivered with such calm conviction, only confirmed fears he had been reluctant to fully acknowledge. I will investigate this matter personally, he said finally. If what you say proves true, Henry Vale will face consequences, regardless of his years of service to this household. Thank you, Eleanor said simply, turning to leave. Miss Hartley, the Duke said, stopping her at the door. She turned back, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since their confrontation at the garden party. For what it is worth, I did not intend for my words that evening to invite this kind of danger toward you or your horse. I spoke carelessly, out of pride, and I regret that my carelessness may have contributed to what has followed. Eleanor studied him for a moment, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Words carry more weight than people often realize, Your Grace, especially when spoken by someone as influential as yourself. She left Ashcombe Hall that afternoon with a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling in her chest, something beyond simple relief at having confronted the situation directly. The Duke's apology, brief and imperfect as it was, had revealed a side of him she had not expected to encounter, one far removed from the chuckling, dismissive figure who had mocked her so publicly months earlier. True to his word, the Duke conducted a thorough investigation over the following days, questioning stable hands and household staff, quietly but persistently, until the full extent of Henry's actions became impossible to deny. Faced with mounting evidence and Daniel's first-hand testimony, Henry ultimately confessed to everything, admitting his long-standing resentment toward the Hartley family and his fear that Thundercrest's unbroken record might finally fall. The Duke dismissed him from service immediately, a decision that sent ripples of shock through the county, particularly among those who had long assumed Henry's position was unshakable given his years of loyal service. For Eleanor, the news brought a measure of relief, though she remained cautious, aware that other obstacles might still lie ahead before November finally arrived. For the Duke, Henry's dismissal marked something of a turning point as well. He found himself reflecting more seriously on his own role in setting these events into motion, on the casual cruelty of his words at the garden party, and on the quiet strength Eleanor had displayed throughout the difficult weeks that followed. What had begun as an amusing diversion at a social gathering had evolved into something far more consequential, and the Duke could no longer pretend otherwise, even to himself. A crowd of nearly 40 people had gathered along the training fence by the time Eleanor arrived at dawn, far more than had ever come to watch before. Word of Henry Vale's dismissal had spread through every corner of the county within days, transforming the story from simple gossip about an eccentric wager into something the entire community now followed with genuine interest. Eleanor felt the weight of their attention pressing against her as she led Whisper out for morning training, uncertain whether the growing audience helped or hindered her concentration. "Ignore them," Mr. Pruitt advised, watching the crowd with a critical eye. "They will be there in far greater numbers come November. Better to grow accustomed to their presence now, while the stakes remain only practice." Eleanor nodded, though she found it difficult to fully dismiss the murmur of voices following her every move around the training field. Some called out encouragement, others simply watched in curious silence, and a few, she suspected, still hoped quietly to witness her failure despite the recent scandal surrounding Henry's actions. Among the crowd one morning stood the Duke himself, arriving quietly on horseback and remaining at a respectful distance from the fence line. Eleanor noticed him almost immediately, though she said nothing, continuing her training routine with practiced focus despite the added awareness of his presence. He watched for nearly an hour, saying little to the small group of onlookers around him, before finally riding away without approaching her directly. This pattern repeated itself several times over the following 2 weeks. The Duke would arrive unannounced, observe her training from a distance, and depart quietly, never engaging her in conversation, yet clearly no longer able to dismiss her efforts as the foolish endeavor he had once imagined them to be. Eleanor found herself increasingly curious about his motivations, though she refused to let the question distract her from the demanding work still ahead. Charlotte noticed the pattern too, teasing her friend gently one evening as they sat together after training. "The Duke seems remarkably invested in your progress, for a man who once laughed you out of his garden party. He is likely only worried about his champion's reputation," Eleanor replied, though even she recognized a hint of uncertainty in her own explanation. "Perhaps," Charlotte said, smiling slightly. "Or perhaps something else entirely." Eleanor waved away the suggestion, though the conversation lingered in her thoughts longer than she cared to admit. She had little time to dwell on such questions regardless, as her training schedule grew increasingly demanding with each passing day. Mr. Pruitt introduced new challenges constantly now, testing Whisper against sudden changes in terrain, unexpected noises, and the kind of crowded, chaotic conditions she would likely encounter on the actual day of the race. Daniel remained a steady presence throughout this period, though he grew noticeably more cautious about his visits following Henry's dismissal, aware that his own position within the Duke's household had shifted in ways he did not yet fully understand. The Duke had questioned him extensively during the investigation into Henry's sabotage, and though Daniel had answered honestly and without incident, he could not shake a lingering uncertainty about his future employment. "The Duke asked me directly why I chose to help you," Daniel confided to Eleanor one evening, as they walked together along the familiar fence line. "I told him the truth, that I believed Whisper deserved a fair chance to prove herself, regardless of who trained her." "How did he respond?" Eleanor asked. "He seemed thoughtful more than angry," Daniel said. "He did not dismiss me, though he made clear he expected my full attention to remain with Thundercrest's training going forward, at least publicly." Eleanor considered this information carefully, aware of the increasingly complicated position Daniel now occupied, caught between loyalty to his employer and the genuine friendship that had developed between himself and Eleanor over the preceding weeks. She resolved to rely less heavily on his direct assistance going forward, not wanting his continued generosity to cost him his livelihood entirely. As October settled fully over the county, bringing the first frost of the season and the unmistakable scent of autumn leaves burning in distant fields, the intensity of Eleanor's preparation reached its peak. Mr. Pruitt now insisted on running the full race distance nearly every other day, carefully monitoring Whisper's recovery time and adjusting her diet to maximize both strength and stamina heading into the final stretch before the Ashcombe Cup. The mare had transformed remarkably since the wager first began. Where once she had struggled with distances beyond a single mile, she now covered the entire 4-mile course with a confidence and rhythm that surprised even Mr. Pruitt, who had trained countless horses throughout his long career. Her stride had lengthened, her breathing had steadied, and something in her bearing suggested a horse who understood, in whatever way horses understand such things, that something important awaited her at the end of this demanding preparation. Meanwhile, reports continued reaching Eleanor about Thundercrest's own training, delivered secondhand through various sources throughout the county, who followed the unfolding story with rapt attention. The Duke's champion remained formidable, his raw speed undiminished by the years of consistent victory, his training conducted with all the resources and expertise that came naturally to a stable of Ashcombe's considerable reputation. Yet Eleanor found herself less intimidated by these reports than she might have expected months earlier. The strategic knowledge she had gained regarding Thundercrest's racing patterns, combined with the deep partnership she had developed with Whisper through weeks of demanding training, gave her a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with matching her opponent's raw speed, and everything to do with outmaneuvering him through patience and precise timing. One particularly cold morning, as frost coated the fields in a thin silver layer, the Duke arrived at his usual observation point along the fence, though this time he did not simply watch from a distance. He dismounted his horse and approached the fence directly, waiting until Eleanor completed her current training pass before speaking. "Your mare has improved considerably," he said, his tone carrying none of the mocking amusement that had characterized their earlier encounter. "I confess, I did not expect such progress when I made that careless comment at the garden party." Eleanor studied him carefully, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected acknowledgement. Progress does not guarantee victory, Your Grace. Thundercrest remains the fastest horse in the county, by every account I have heard. Perhaps, the Duke said, but speed alone has never won every race in history. There is something else at work here, something I find myself increasingly curious about. And what is that? Eleanor asked. Determination, the Duke said simply. The kind that refuses to accept defeat before the outcome has even been decided. I confess, I underestimated how powerful that quality could prove when I first dismissed your challenge so carelessly. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, uncertain how to interpret this shift in his demeanor, this unexpected admission of respect from a man who had so thoroughly humiliated her months earlier. "Thank you for saying so," she finally replied, "though I would rather prove it through the race itself than through words exchanged beforehand." The Duke smiled slightly, something genuine replacing the mocking amusement she remembered so vividly from their first encounter. "A fair point, Miss Hartley. I look forward to November, with considerably more anticipation than I once imagined possible." He rode away shortly afterward, leaving Eleanor, standing at the fence, with a strange mixture of satisfaction and lingering uncertainty churning through her thoughts. The wager that had begun as a careless joke had clearly transformed into something far more significant for both parties involved, though Eleanor remained uncertain exactly what that transformation might ultimately mean, beyond the increasingly urgent countdown toward the race itself. Whisper reared suddenly during a routine training pass, throwing Eleanor hard against the ground and galloping wildly toward the tree line, before Mr. Pruitt managed to catch her reins. Eleanor lay stunned in the cold grass for several long seconds, the wind knocked completely from her lungs, before Charlotte reached her side, panic evident in her voice as she called out for help. "Eleanor, can you hear me? Are you hurt?" Eleanor managed to sit up slowly, testing her limbs carefully before nodding, though a sharp pain radiated through her left shoulder, where she had landed hardest against the frozen ground. "I am all right. What happened? She has never reared like that before." Mr. Pruitt examined Whisper carefully once he had calmed her enough to approach, running his experienced hands along her legs and flanks until he discovered a small, sharp burr lodged deep beneath her saddle blanket, positioned exactly where it would cause maximum irritation with every stride. "This did not happen by accident," he said grimly, holding up the offending object for Eleanor to see. "Someone placed this deliberately before we began training this morning." The revelation sent a chill through the small group gathered around the injured mare. Henry Vale's dismissal had seemingly ended the direct threats against Eleanor's preparation, yet clearly, someone else remained determined to see her fail. Someone who understood exactly how to inflict damage without leaving obvious evidence of foul play. News of this latest incident reached the Duke within hours, delivered by a worried servant who had overheard the commotion while passing near the Hartley property on other business. The Duke arrived at the stable himself that same afternoon, his expression grave as he surveyed the scene and listened to Mr. Pruitt's account of what had happened. "I dismissed Henry weeks ago," the Duke said, frustration evident in his voice. "I do not understand how this could continue." "Perhaps Henry was not acting entirely alone," Mr. Pruitt suggested carefully. "Or perhaps someone else has taken up his cause since his departure, motivated by reasons of their own." The Duke considered this possibility with obvious discomfort, aware that such continued sabotage reflected poorly not only on his household, but on the very wager he himself had initiated months earlier, through careless words spoken in a moment of social pressure. He resolved to investigate the matter personally, questioning remaining stable staff and tightening security around both his own property and, with Eleanor's reluctant permission, the Hartley estate as well. Meanwhile, Eleanor faced a difficult decision regarding her own recovery. Her shoulder, though not broken, remained painfully swollen and limited her range of motion considerably, threatening to interrupt her training schedule during these critical final weeks before the race. Charlotte urged rest, worried that pushing too hard too soon might cause permanent damage that could affect her performance far more seriously than any temporary delay. "You cannot ride effectively with an injury like this," Charlotte insisted. "Rest for even a few days. November is still weeks away." "Every day matters now," Eleanor replied, though she winced as she attempted to raise her arm above shoulder height. "I cannot afford to lose momentum this close to the race." Mr. Pruitt, ever practical, suggested a compromise that satisfied neither Eleanor's impatience nor Charlotte's caution entirely, but represented a reasonable middle path. Eleanor would rest her shoulder for 3 full days, allowing the worst of the swelling to subside, while continuing lighter forms of preparation that did not require full riding capability, including detailed strategy sessions, reviewing the race course, and careful groundwork, with Whisper, that placed minimal strain on her injured shoulder. During this brief period of reduced physical training, Eleanor found herself with unexpected time to reflect on everything that had transpired since the garden party months earlier. She thought often of the Duke's changed demeanor, the genuine respect that had gradually replaced his initial mockery, and wondered what exactly this transformation meant for their relationship beyond the immediate context of the wager itself. Daniel visited during this period as well, though his visits had grown noticeably rarer since Henry's dismissal, a caution Eleanor understood even as she missed his steady presence and expertise. When he did arrive one quiet evening, his expression carried a seriousness that immediately caught Eleanor's attention. "I believe I know who placed the burr beneath Whisper's saddle blanket," he said without preamble, glancing around to ensure no one else could overhear their conversation. "Who?" Eleanor asked immediately. "A stable hand named Edmund Gray," Daniel said. "He has long hoped to become the Duke's primary jockey, once Thundercrest's current rider retires, a position that would be significantly more secure and prestigious, should Thundercrest's unbroken record remain intact through this year's Ashcombe Cup. I overheard him speaking privately with another worker, boasting about actions taken to, in his words, remind the Hartley mare who truly belongs on a racing track." Eleanor absorbed this information with a mixture of anger and weary resignation. It seems Henry's dismissal simply shifted the danger to someone new, rather than eliminating it entirely. "I have not yet brought this information to the Duke," Daniel admitted. "I wanted to speak with you first, given how the previous situation unfolded." "We must tell him," Eleanor said firmly. "Regardless of how uncomfortable such conversations may prove, if we remain silent, Edmund Gray may grow bolder still, just as Henry did before him." Together, they approached the Duke the following morning, presenting Daniel's information carefully and directly. The Duke listened, with visible frustration, clearly troubled that such behavior continued within his household, despite his recent efforts to address the underlying problem entirely. "I will handle this matter personally and swiftly," he assured them both. "I owe you my sincere apologies, Miss Hartley, that my own household continues to threaten your fair chance at this competition. This reflects poorly on myself, and on Ashcombe Hall as a whole." True to his word, the Duke confronted Edmund Grey directly that same afternoon, and though the young stable hand initially denied any wrongdoing, mounting evidence combined with the Duke's evident determination eventually produced a reluctant confession. Edmund was dismissed immediately, joining Henry Vale among those who had underestimated both Eleanor's resolve and the Duke's genuine commitment to ensuring a fair competition, regardless of how the wager itself had originally begun. With both immediate threats now removed from within the Duke's household, Eleanor felt a cautious sense of relief settle over her preparation, though the physical toll of her injury still lingered as November drew inexorably closer. Her shoulder healed steadily over the following week, allowing her to resume full training with careful attention to avoiding further strain, while Mr. Pruitt adjusted her riding technique slightly to compensate for any lingering weakness. The Duke, for his part, began visiting the Hartley stable with greater frequency and openness following these events, no longer hiding at a cautious distance, but engaging directly with Eleanor's training progress, offering occasional insights drawn from his own extensive experience with horses and racing strategy. Their conversations remained professional in tone, focused primarily on the upcoming race, yet something warmer had clearly developed between them, a mutual respect neither had anticipated when their acquaintance began with such public humiliation months earlier. As the final weeks before the Ashcombe Cup approached, Eleanor found herself facing not only the physical and strategic challenges of the race itself, but an unexpected emotional complexity regarding the man whose careless words had set this entire journey into motion. Whatever November ultimately brought, she suspected the outcome would prove far more complicated than a simple victory or defeat between two horses on a single autumn afternoon. 3 weeks before the race, Eleanor discovered a folded letter tucked beneath Whisper's stall door, unsigned, the handwriting deliberately disguised in jagged, uneven strokes. She unfolded it with trembling hands, reading the message twice before the full weight of its meaning settled over her. "Withdraw from the race now," it read, "or something far worse than a broken cartwheel will happen before November arrives." She showed the letter to Mr. Pruitt immediately, watching his weathered face harden as he read the threatening words. "This is different from what came before," he said grimly. "Henry and Edmund acted out of personal grievance and ambition. This reads like something else entirely, someone with far more to lose should you actually win." Eleanor considered this carefully. Who would benefit most from Thundercrest's continued victory, beyond the Duke's own household? Mr. Pruitt thought for a long moment before answering. "Wealthy men throughout the county have placed considerable wagers on the outcome of this race, Eleanor. Some have staked significant portions of their fortune on Thundercrest's continued dominance. If word spread that you posed genuine competition, those men would have strong financial incentive to ensure that competition never materialized." This realization added an unsettling new dimension to the danger surrounding Eleanor's preparation. Where Henry and Edmund had acted from personal spite and ambition within the Duke's own household, this new threat suggested a wider, more calculated conspiracy, one potentially involving powerful men throughout the county, who stood to lose considerable sums should the wager's outcome prove less predictable than expected. Eleanor brought the letter directly to the Duke that same evening, watching his expression shift from concern to genuine alarm as he read the threatening words for himself. "This must be reported to the local magistrate immediately," he said firmly. "Whoever wrote this has moved beyond simple sabotage into outright intimidation, and possibly worse." The magistrate, a stern but fair man named Mr. Whitmore, took the matter seriously, though he cautioned that anonymous threats proved notoriously difficult to trace, particularly when potentially connected to wealthy individuals with considerable resources and influence throughout the county. He assigned additional watchmen to patrol near the Hartley property during the remaining weeks before the race, though he could offer little additional reassurance beyond this modest measure. The Duke, troubled by the growing danger surrounding Eleanor's preparation, made an unexpected offer during their conversation with the magistrate. "I would like to provide additional security directly from my own household staff," he said. "Men, I trust personally, who can watch over both Miss Hartley and her horse during these final critical weeks." Eleanor hesitated before accepting this offer, uncertain about accepting further assistance from the very household that had already produced 2 separate saboteurs during the preceding months. Yet the escalating danger left her with little choice but to accept whatever protection she could reasonably secure before the race finally arrived. 2 of the Duke's most trusted men began patrolling the Hartley property each night, their presence providing at least some measure of reassurance during what remained an undeniably tense period. Eleanor continued her training with renewed determination, refusing to let the threatening letter derail the progress she and Whisper had achieved through months of demanding preparation. During this period, the relationship between Eleanor and the Duke continued to deepen in ways neither had fully anticipated when their acquaintance began. He visited nearly every day now, sometimes offering practical advice regarding race strategy, other times simply observing her training in comfortable silence that required no particular conversation to feel meaningful. Charlotte noticed the shift immediately, teasing her friend gently about the frequency of these visits, though Eleanor remained reluctant to examine her own feelings too closely, given everything else demanding her attention. One particularly clear evening, as autumn colors blazed across the surrounding hills, in brilliant shades of orange and gold, the Duke lingered longer than usual after Eleanor completed her training for the day. They walked together along the fence line, the comfortable silence between them eventually giving way to quiet conversation about matters far removed from horses and racing strategy. "I have thought often about that evening at the garden party," the Duke admitted, his gaze fixed on the distant hills rather than directly on Eleanor. "I spoke carelessly, driven by pride and a foolish need to appear amused rather than genuinely challenged. I regret the pain those words caused you, far beyond whatever amusement they provided my guests that evening." "Your words motivated me in ways I could not have predicted," Eleanor replied honestly. "Perhaps I owe you some measure of gratitude, despite the difficulty of these past months." "I would rather you owed me nothing at all," the Duke said, turning to meet her gaze directly. "I would rather simply know that whatever happens in November, our acquaintance need not end with the conclusion of this wager." Eleanor felt her heart quicken at these words, uncertain exactly how to respond to such an unexpected admission. "That depends, perhaps, on how November concludes," she said carefully. "Does it truly?" the Duke asked, something searching in his expression that Eleanor found difficult to interpret fully. "I confess I have grown to respect you considerably beyond the context of this race alone, Miss Hartley. Whatever the outcome, I would hope our acquaintance might continue regardless." Before Eleanor could formulate a response to this unexpected declaration, one of the Duke's patrolmen approached hurriedly from the direction of the stable, his expression tense with obvious urgency. "Your Grace, Miss Hartley, you should come quickly. We have discovered something concerning near the training track." They followed him immediately, discovering upon arrival that someone had dug a shallow but potentially dangerous trench across a section of the training path typically used during Eleanor's fastest practice runs, cleverly disguised beneath a thin layer of loose leaves and dirt that would have been nearly invisible until a galloping horse struck it directly. "Had Whisper hit this at full speed," Mr. Pruitt said grimly, examining the trench by lantern light, "the results could have been catastrophic for both horse and rider." The Duke's expression turned to genuine fury as he surveyed the dangerous obstacle. "This has moved beyond mere intimidation into something approaching outright attempted harm. I will not tolerate this any further. Whoever remains responsible for these continued threats will face the full consequences of the law, regardless of their standing or wealth within this county." Eleanor stood beside him, shaken by how close disaster had come to striking during what should have been routine training, yet also strangely steadied by the genuine outrage evident in the Duke's reaction. Whatever complicated feelings had developed between them over recent weeks, his commitment to ensuring her safety and the fairness of their wager appeared entirely genuine, a stark contrast to the careless mockery that had characterized their first encounter so many months earlier. With less than 3 weeks remaining before the Ashcombe Cup, Eleanor found herself navigating not only the physical demands of final preparation, but an increasingly complex web of danger, suspicion, and unexpected personal connection that threatened to overshadow the race itself. Yet through it all, her determination remained unshaken, her partnership with Whisper stronger than ever, and her resolve to prove herself before the entire county firmer than the day the wager had first been made. A carriage rolled to an abrupt stop outside the Hartley stable early one morning, and a well-dressed stranger stepped down, introducing himself as Mr. Alistair Kingsley, a wealthy landowner from the neighboring county, whom Eleanor had never met before that moment. His expression carried a practiced friendliness that immediately put her on guard, though she invited him inside out of simple courtesy. "I have heard remarkable things about your training progress, Miss Hartley," Kingsley began, settling into a chair near the stable office, with an ease that suggested considerable confidence in his own charm. "I represent a group of gentlemen who have placed significant wagers on this year's Ashcombe Cup. We would like to propose an arrangement that might prove mutually beneficial." Eleanor felt a familiar wariness settle over her, recognizing immediately where this conversation was likely heading. "What sort of arrangement, Mr. Kingsley?" "A generous sum," he said smoothly, delivered discreetly, "in exchange for your horse experiencing a minor setback shortly before the race. Nothing dramatic, you understand. Simply enough to ensure Thundercrest's continued victory remains uncontested." Eleanor stood immediately, her expression hardening with barely controlled anger. "You are suggesting I deliberately sabotage my own horse's chances, after everything Whisper and I have endured these past months?" "I am suggesting a practical solution," Kingsley replied, seemingly unbothered by her obvious outrage. "You would receive considerable compensation, far more than any prize money the race itself might offer, while avoiding the risk and expense of continued training against impossible odds." "Get out of my stable," Eleanor said firmly, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even herself. "I will not sell my integrity, nor betray everything Whisper and I have worked toward, for any sum of money you might offer." Kingsley's expression flickered briefly with surprise, before settling back into his practiced calm. "A pity, Miss Hartley. I had hoped we might avoid unpleasantness. Perhaps you will reconsider before November arrives, once you fully understand the resources and determination of those I represent." He left shortly afterward, his carriage disappearing down the road, while Eleanor remained standing in stunned silence, processing the full implications of what had just occurred. This confirmed her worst suspicions regarding the anonymous threat and the dangerous trench discovered near the training track. Powerful men with considerable financial stakes in the race's outcome were now directly attempting to influence the result, moving from anonymous intimidation to open bribery. She reported the encounter to the Duke immediately, watching his expression darken with genuine alarm as she recounted every detail of Kingsley's proposal. "This man must be reported to the magistrate at once," he said firmly. "Attempted bribery, combined with the previous threats and sabotage, paints a clear picture of coordinated criminal activity surrounding this race." Mr. Whitmore, the local magistrate, took the new information seriously, launching a formal investigation into Kingsley's activities and the broader network of wagers surrounding the Ashcombe Cup. Though proving direct criminal responsibility for the earlier sabotage attempts remained difficult given the anonymous nature of those actions, Kingsley's brazen attempt at bribery provided concrete evidence that could no longer be easily dismissed or ignored. News of the bribery attempt spread through the county with remarkable speed, shifting public opinion even further in Eleanor's favor. What had begun as an amusing wager born from careless words at a garden party had transformed, in the eyes of most county residents, into a genuine testament to integrity and determination against considerable and increasingly sinister opposition. Eleanor found herself thinking often, during this tense period, about how dramatically circumstances had shifted since that first humiliating evening. She had entered this wager, seeking simply to prove her own capability and restore some measure of her family's diminished reputation. Now she found herself at the center of a genuine controversy involving corruption, attempted bribery, and increasingly dangerous sabotage, all converging toward a single afternoon in November that seemed to carry far greater significance than she had ever originally imagined. The Duke's continued support throughout this escalating situation deepened the connection between them considerably, their conversations growing more personal and less guarded with each passing day. One evening, as they reviewed race strategy together, in the quiet warmth of the stable office, the Duke set aside the papers between them and looked at her directly. "Regardless of what happens in November," he said quietly, "I want you to understand something, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name, rather than the more formal address he had maintained throughout their acquaintance. "The courage and integrity you have shown throughout these difficult months has changed how I view not only this wager, but many assumptions I once held about capability and determination more broadly." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at these words, mixed with lingering uncertainty about what exactly this growing connection between them truly meant. "Thank you, Nathaniel," she replied, using his given name in return, testing how the familiarity felt between them after months of formal distance. He smiled genuinely at this small gesture, something warm and unguarded, replacing the careful composure he typically maintained in public settings. "I find myself looking forward to whatever comes after November, Eleanor, regardless of which horse crosses the finish line first." Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed throughout the county, adding yet another layer of interest to the already captivating story unfolding around the Ashcombe Cup wager. Some speculated openly about romantic feelings developing between the Duke and the determined young woman who had dared to challenge his champion, while others focused primarily on the unfolding investigation into Kingsley's attempted bribery and the broader implications for gambling practices throughout the county. With just 2 weeks remaining before the race, Eleanor's final preparations reached their most intensive phase yet. Mr. Pruitt introduced increasingly realistic race simulations, complete with crowd noise and sudden distractions, designed to mimic actual race day conditions as closely as possible. Whisper responded remarkably well to these challenges, her confidence and focus growing steadily, despite the ongoing tensions surrounding the broader circumstances of the wager. Yet even as her training reached its peak, Eleanor remained acutely aware that the danger surrounding her preparation had not fully disappeared. Kingsley's network of associates remained largely unidentified, and the magistrate's investigation, while promising, had not yet produced conclusive results that might fully guarantee her safety through the remaining critical days before November finally arrived. Thousands of spectators packed the fields surrounding Ashcombe Hall on the morning of the race, their voices rising into a steady roar of anticipation as the first day of November dawned clear and cold across the county. Eleanor stood beside Whisper near the starting line, her heart pounding fiercely, as she surveyed the enormous crowd that had gathered to witness the culmination of everything she and her mare had endured over the preceding months. Thundercrest stood nearby, his powerful frame gleaming in the morning light, handled by a new rider brought in following Edmund Gray's dismissal weeks earlier. The champion horse appeared calm and confident, accustomed to the pressure of competition after years of unbroken victory, while Whisper shifted nervously beneath Eleanor, sensing the tension radiating from the massive crowd surrounding them. "Remember everything we discussed," Mr. Pruitt said quietly, adjusting Whisper's saddle one final time. "Patience through the early miles. Save your strength for the final stretch, exactly as we practiced." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She glanced toward the Duke, standing near the starting official's platform, his expression a complicated mixture of anticipation and something warmer that she had grown increasingly familiar with over recent weeks. He caught her gaze and offered a small, encouraging nod. Silent support conveyed across the considerable distance separating them. The starting signal fired precisely at 9 in the morning, and both horses surged forward simultaneously, their powerful strides eating up the ground as the massive crowd erupted into cheering that seemed to shake the very air around them. Thundercrest immediately took the lead, his superior early speed proving exactly as formidable as his reputation suggested, while Eleanor held Whisper back deliberately, allowing the gap to widen according to the careful strategy she and Mr. Pruitt had developed over countless hours of preparation. The first mile passed in a blur of pounding hooves and roaring spectators, Thundercrest maintaining a comfortable lead, while Whisper settled into the steady, efficient rhythm that had become her hallmark throughout months of demanding training. Eleanor felt her nerves gradually settle as her mare responded exactly as practiced, conserving strength while maintaining a pace that kept the champion within reasonable striking distance, rather than allowing him to disappear entirely beyond recovery. By the second mile, winding through the dense forest section of the course, the gap between the two horses had narrowed slightly. Thundercrest's pace, settling into the comfortable rhythm Daniel had described months earlier, during his careful analysis of the champion's racing patterns. Eleanor guided Whisper skillfully through the tighter forest turns, using her mare's superior agility to gain small but meaningful advantages that raw speed alone could not provide. Emerging from the forest into the long open meadow that formed the course's middle section, Eleanor caught her first clear glimpse of Thundercrest's rider glancing back over his shoulder, a flicker of surprise crossing his features at finding the supposedly overmatched mare closer than anticipated at this stage of the race. This small moment of hesitation, Eleanor realized with a surge of determination, represented exactly the kind of opportunity Mr. Pruitt had spent months preparing her to recognize and exploit. She urged Whisper forward slightly, closing the gap further as they entered the meadow's long straightaway, the crowd's roar intensifying as spectators recognized the genuine competition unfolding before them, rather than the predictable, one-sided victory most had originally expected. Thundercrest's rider responded by pushing his mount harder, refusing to allow the upstart challenger any further ground, and the two horses settled into a fierce, closely matched pace through the meadow's considerable length. As they approached the final 2 miles, winding back through rolling hills before the final approach toward Ashcombe Hall itself, Eleanor felt Whisper's strength remaining remarkably steady despite the demanding pace, a testament to months of careful conditioning that had prepared her mare specifically for this crucial final stretch. Thundercrest, by contrast, showed the first subtle signs of fatigue, his powerful stride losing some of its earlier crispness as the accumulated distance began exacting its toll. This was precisely the moment Daniel had identified during his careful analysis, the point where the champion's trainers typically demanded one final burst of speed to secure victory before fatigue could fully set in. Eleanor watched carefully as Thundercrest's rider, indeed, pushed for exactly this final surge, the champion responding with an impressive burst that once again extended his lead by several crucial lengths. Yet Eleanor held her own strategy steady, resisting the urge to match this surge immediately, trusting instead in the careful timing she and Mr. Pruitt had rehearsed countless times throughout their demanding training sessions. She waited, watching for the telltale signs that Thundercrest's burst had reached its natural limit, the moment when his powerful stride would inevitably begin shortening, as accumulated fatigue finally caught up with his impressive early pace. That moment arrived with less than a mile remaining, as Ashcombe Hall's impressive silhouette came into clear view ahead. Thundercrest's stride visibly shortened, his breathing growing labored despite his rider's continued urging, while Whisper, conserved carefully through months of patient strategy, found new reserves of strength precisely when they mattered most. Eleanor leaned forward, urging her mare into the powerful final surge they had practiced so extensively, feeling Whisper respond, with everything she had left, her hooves pounding a rapid, determined rhythm across the final stretch of open ground. The crowd's roar reached a deafening crescendo as spectators recognized what was unfolding before them, the previously unthinkable possibility that the underdog mare might actually overtake the county's unbeaten champion in these final crucial moments. Whisper drew steadily closer to Thundercrest with every stride, the gap narrowing from several lengths to merely one, then to almost nothing, as both horses approached the final quarter-mile stretch before the finish line. Eleanor felt every muscle in her body straining alongside her mare, willing every last measure of speed and determination from the partnership they had built together, through months of shared struggle and unwavering commitment. With barely 100 yards remaining, Whisper drew fully level with the exhausted champion, the two horses running neck and neck as the finish line rushed toward them with impossible speed. The crowd's roar had transformed into something almost deafening, thousands of voices screaming encouragement toward both competitors, as the outcome remained genuinely uncertain until the very final strides. Whisper surged forward in one final, powerful effort, crossing the finish line a full length ahead of Thundercrest as the assembled crowd erupted into an explosion of sound, unlike anything Ashcombe County had witnessed in living memory. Eleanor slowed her mare gradually, tears streaming freely down her face as the full weight of the victory settled over her, disbelief and overwhelming joy mixing together in equal measure. The crowd surged forward around them, cheering and celebrating with an enthusiasm that made clear exactly how thoroughly Eleanor's determination had captured the imagination of the entire county over these past demanding months. She dismounted slowly, her legs trembling from exhaustion and emotion alike, pressing her forehead against Whisper's sweat-soaked neck in a moment of profound gratitude toward the mare who had made this impossible victory genuinely possible. The Duke approached through the celebrating crowd, his expression carrying none of the mocking amusement from their first encounter so many months earlier, replaced instead by genuine admiration and something warmer still that made Eleanor's already racing heart quicken further. He stopped before her, and for a long moment, neither spoke, the enormous crowd around them seeming to fade into distant background noise. "You did it," he said finally, his voice carrying quiet wonder. "Everyone who laughed that evening at the garden party, myself included, owes you a debt of humility we can never fully repay. No one is laughing now." Eleanor said softly, echoing words that seemed to capture perfectly the extraordinary journey these past months had represented. No, the Duke agreed, a genuine smile spreading across his features. No one is laughing now, Eleanor. And I suspect no one in this county will ever underestimate you again. Word of Eleanor's victory spread far beyond Ashcombe County within days, carried by travelers and newspaper reports to neighboring regions that had followed the increasingly dramatic story of sabotage, bribery, and ultimate triumph with growing fascination. The magistrate's investigation into Mr. Kingsley's attempted bribery gained renewed momentum in the aftermath of the race, bolstered by additional witnesses who came forward once the immediate danger of retaliation seemed to have passed. Within a month, sufficient evidence had accumulated to bring formal charges against Kingsley and 2 associates who had similarly attempted to influence the race's outcome through bribery and intimidation. The resulting trial, conducted publicly and covered extensively throughout the county, exposed a wider pattern of corrupt wagering practices that had gone unaddressed for years, ultimately leading to significant reforms in how such races were regulated and monitored going forward. Eleanor's father, watching these developments unfold from the modest cottage that remained of the family's once considerable estate, found himself approached by former associates and acquaintances who had distanced themselves during the family's earlier financial difficulties. Eleanor's victory, and the integrity she had demonstrated throughout the increasingly dangerous months preceding it, restored the Hartley family name to a respectability it had lacked since the failed shipping investment years earlier. "Your mother would have been immensely proud," he told Eleanor one quiet evening, shortly after the race, tears glistening in his eyes as he embraced his daughter warmly. "She always believed pride meant nothing without the courage to prove it through action, and you have proven that more thoroughly than I ever imagined possible." Mr. Pruitt, whose expertise and patient guidance had proven so instrumental throughout Eleanor's demanding training, found his reputation similarly restored following the victory, with several prominent families throughout the county approaching him regarding future training opportunities, despite his advancing age and physical limitations. He accepted a modest role advising several younger trainers, content to share the considerable knowledge accumulated over his long career, rather than returning to the demanding daily work of training horses himself. Daniel Foxwell's role in Eleanor's ultimate victory did not go unrecognized either. The Duke, having witnessed firsthand the young stablehand's integrity and genuine horsemanship throughout the preceding months, offered him a significantly expanded position within the Ashcombe household, overseeing training practices with an authority and respect that had been entirely unavailable to him under Henry Vale's previous management. Daniel accepted gratefully, finding in this new role an opportunity to apply his considerable talents without the compromising pressures that had characterized his earlier position. Charlotte Bell remained a steady and supportive presence throughout the weeks following the race, celebrating alongside her closest friend, while also gently teasing Eleanor about the increasingly obvious romantic connection that had developed between herself and the Duke throughout their shared ordeal. "I told you there was something else entirely behind his frequent visits," she reminded Eleanor more than once, laughing warmly at her friend's continued attempts to downplay the growing relationship. The Duke himself made no attempt to hide his admiration for Eleanor following the race, visiting the Hartley estate regularly in the weeks that followed, their conversations gradually evolving from careful discussions of racing strategy into something considerably more personal and affectionate. He formally invited Eleanor and her father to dine at Ashcombe Hall on several occasions, gestures that did not go unnoticed by county society, which had already begun speculating enthusiastically about a potential match between the wealthy Duke and the determined young woman who had so thoroughly humbled his celebrated champion. Nearly 2 months after the race, on a crisp winter afternoon, with snow beginning to dust the surrounding hills, the Duke visited the Hartley stable once more, finding Eleanor in her familiar place beside Whisper, grooming the mare with the same careful attention that had characterized their entire journey together. He watched quietly for several minutes before finally speaking. "I have thought carefully about everything that has happened between us these past months," he said, his voice carrying a seriousness Eleanor had rarely heard from him before. "What began as a careless jest at a garden party has led me somewhere I never expected to find myself, toward feelings considerably deeper than mere admiration for your remarkable determination." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her heart quickening at the evident sincerity in his expression. "And where exactly has this journey led you, Nathaniel?" "Toward you," he said simply, closing the remaining distance between them. "I find myself unable to imagine my future without your presence within it, Eleanor. Whatever society might say about a duke and a horse trainer's daughter, I care considerably more for genuine partnership and mutual respect than for empty social convention." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by how thoroughly their relationship had transformed since that humiliating evening so many months earlier. "I never imagined, standing beside that fountain while you laughed at my ambitions, that we would arrive somewhere quite like this." "Nor did I," the Duke admitted, a warm smile spreading across his features. "Though I confess, I am profoundly grateful that we did." Their courtship, conducted with considerably more openness and warmth than county society had initially expected, eventually led to a wedding celebrated the following spring, drawing guests from throughout the region who had followed their remarkable story with genuine fascination since that first fateful garden party gathering. Eleanor's father walked her down the aisle with evident pride, while Charlotte served as her closest attendant, and Daniel and Mr. Pruitt watched from places of honor among the assembled guests who had supported Eleanor throughout her extraordinary journey. Whisper herself received a place of honor at Ashcombe Hall following the wedding, retired from competitive racing, but maintained, with the same careful attention that had characterized her training throughout the demanding months leading to her historic victory. Eleanor rode her regularly still, though now for pleasure rather than the desperate determination that had once driven their partnership through such considerable danger and difficulty. The Ashcombe Cup itself underwent significant reforms in the years following Eleanor's remarkable victory, with new regulations implemented to prevent the kind of corruption and sabotage that had nearly derailed her historic achievement. Women began entering the competition with increasing regularity in subsequent years, inspired by the story of the determined young woman who had refused to accept a duke's careless dismissal as the final word on her capability. Years later, when their own daughter expressed interest in following her mother's footsteps toward competitive racing, Eleanor found herself smiling at the beautiful symmetry life had provided. She thought often, during these peaceful years of marriage and genuine partnership with the man who had once mocked her so publicly, about how dramatically circumstances could transform when courage and determination refused to yield before seemingly impossible odds. The garden party where everything began remained a favorite story told throughout the county for years afterward, though the ending had changed considerably from what anyone present that fateful evening could have possibly predicted. "Let her attempt it," the Duke had said, chuckling dismissively before an amused crowd of onlookers. No one was laughing by November, and few would ever forget the remarkable journey that had transformed careless mockery into genuine love, forged through months of shared adversity, unwavering determination, and the kind of courage that refuses to accept defeat before the outcome has truly been decided.